If Arya Stark became Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, it would be a reign unlike any other in Westerosi history. Arya was never one for politics, royal court games, or sitting on a throne. However, if fate forced her into power, she would rule in her own unique way, practical, direct, and unburdened by tradition. The Iron Throne was gone, melted into history by the fire of a dying dragon. But the game of power remained, just as cruel, just as unyielding. Westeros needed a ruler, and fate, with its twisted sense of humor, had set its sights on Arya Stark. She had never wanted a crown, never dreamed of ruling. The idea of sitting in one place, burdened by whispers and lies, disgusted her. She had spent her childhood running from kings, not becoming one. But the realm was in chaos. Jon had vanished beyond the wall, his fate uncertain. Bran, the three-eyed raven, had no desire to rule. Sansa was queen in the north and would not abandon her people. The lords of Westeros, still reeling from the war, could not agree on who should lead, and then someone had spoken her name. It started as a jest. A minor lord, too clever for his own good, had smirked and said, "What of Arya Stark? She has Stark blood. She fought in the war. Who would dare challenge her?" Laughter followed, but the laughter faded. The idea took root. The stories of Arya had spread like wildfire. The girl who trained with assassins, who killed the Night King, who walked through shadows like a ghost. Some whispered she was more than a woman, that she was death itself. The lords feared her, and in their fear, they chose her. Arya had been in the Riverlands when the message came, riding alone through the remnants of war. A raven, bearing the seal of King's Landing, brought her fate. The council has spoken. Westeros has chosen its queen. Return at once, your grace. She almost burned the letter, almost ignored it. But something in her, something she did not recognize, held her hand. For years, Arya had lived for herself, for freedom, for the thrill of the unknown. But Westeros was still bleeding. The scars of war had not healed. If she refused, another would take the throne, one less worthy, one who played the game, who would turn the realm into another battlefield. She thought of her father, of her mother, of Robb. She thought of the innocents she had seen die in the streets of King's Landing. She thought of Sansa trying to rebuild the North on her own. Maybe she owed this kingdom something. So Arya Stark turned her horse south, and for the first time in her life, she rode toward power, not away from it. The journey to King's Landing was long, too long. The city still stank of ash and death when she arrived. The Red Keep was a shell of its former self, half burned, its once proud walls crumbling. The throne room was empty, no iron throne, no ghosts of past kings, only a handful of men and women waiting for her arrival. They looked at her as if she were a storm, a force of nature. "Your Grace," a man said, bowing. Arya scoffed. "I'm no queen." "But you are," said another voice. It was Davos Seaworth, the only face she trusted among them. "The people have chosen you, whether you like it or not." She glanced around the room, lords and ladies watching her with cautious eyes. Some believed in her, some feared her, others were waiting for her to fail. She could still refuse. She could leave. But Arya Stark had never been a coward. She stepped forward, meeting their gazes one by one. "If I do this," she said, her voice like steel, "things will change. No more games, no more lies. I won't sit on a throne and let fools whisper in my ear." A murmur rippled through the chamber. "I will rule my way," Arya said, "or not at all." Silence. Then slowly, Davos nodded. "Then rule, your grace." And just like that, Arya Stark became Queen of Westeros. But ruling would not be easy. Shadows lurked, old enemies watched, and Arya had never played by the rules of kings. The game was not over, it had only just begun. Arya Stark never wore a crown. She refused the gilded circlets presented to her. Gold and jewels meant nothing to her, and she had no patience for symbols of power that did nothing but weigh a ruler down. Let the lords and ladies whisper, let them doubt. She would rule by action, not decoration. Her first decree was simple and absolute. The game was over. The council chambers were packed with lords and ladies, all waiting to see what kind of queen Arya would be. Some expected a girl playing at power. Others expected a ruthless killer, a wolf in human skin. Arya was neither, and she was both. She stood at the head of the war table, her hands resting on the wooden surface as she studied the maps before her. The 7 kingdoms were still fractured, villages burned, fields untended, bandits roaming unchecked. The war had ended, but peace had never come. The lords were waiting for her to speak. She let them wait. Finally, she looked up. "The small folk are starving," she said. "The riverlands are still bleeding. The reach is divided. We sit here in our halls and talk of crowns, while half the kingdom drowns in ruin." She turned her gaze to the assembled lords. "Tell me, what have you done about it?" Silence. Lord Grafton, a sharp-eyed noble from the Vale, cleared his throat. Your Grace, we are handling the situation. We have men gathering grain, rebuilding roads. Not fast enough." Arya's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You hoard gold in your treasuries while children go hungry. That ends now." Murmurs, protests, lords shifting uncomfortably. Arya leaned forward, her expression cold. "You serve this realm, not your pockets. Every major house will open its storehouses. Food will be distributed across the war-torn lands. Any lord who refuses will be stripped of his lands and title. His grain will feed the people regardless." A sharp intake of breath. No king or queen had ever dared to threaten noble houses so openly. You cannot just take from the nobility. Lord Velaryon snapped, his knuckles white against the arm of his chair. Arya gave him a slow, knowing smile. "I can, and I will." The lords didn't know what to do with her. She was no politician, no careful weaver of words. She was a warrior, an assassin, a ghost, and they feared her for it. Good. Let them fear. Davos Seaworth was the only one who spoke without hesitation. "It'll take time, Your Grace. The lords will resist." Arya nodded. "Then we don't ask. We take." She turned to Sir Brienne of Tarth, who stood like a pillar of unshaken loyalty. "Gather men, trusted men. I want food distributed within a fortnight. Any lord who stands in the way," her voice lowered, dangerous, "will learn what happens to those who betray their people." Brienne didn't hesitate. She bowed. "As you command, Your Grace." Arya Stark was not a queen who asked. She was a queen who did. That night, Arya stood on the burned ruins of the Red Keep, watching the city below. King's Landing still smelled of death. The air was thick with rot, with the memories of dragonfire. The people who walked the streets did not cheer for her. They barely looked up. They had seen too many rulers come and go. Too many had promised change. Too many had lied. Arya understood their silence. She had no intention of making empty speeches. She would let her actions speak for her. "Your Grace," came a voice behind her. Arya turned. Davos stood there, arms crossed. "You've got the lords pissing themselves," Arya smirked. "Good. Aye, but frightened men do stupid things." Davos stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They'll plot against you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon." Arya looked back at the city. "Let them plot." Davos sighed. "You really don't care for this queen business, do you?" "No," Arya admitted, "but I care about the people." Davos studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Then let's give them a queen worth believing in." Arya Stark had never wanted to rule, but if she was going to do it, she would do it her way, No crowns, no games, no mercy for those who preyed on the weak, and the lords of Westeros were about to learn that the hard way. It did not take long for the lords to test Arya's rule. Less than a fortnight after she had given her decree, reports reached her that House Bracken and House Blackwood had reignited their centuries-old feud in the Riverlands. Blood spilled onto fertile land, grain stores burned, and villagers were caught between two warring banners. Arya didn't call for a council meeting. She didn't waste time sending ravens or demanding explanations. She rode. By the time she and her small retinue arrived, the fields outside Raventree Hall were thick with smoke, the bodies of farmers rotting under the sun. The Bracken and Blackwood men were still clashing, swords ringing through the air, their banners whipping in the wind. Arya did not announce herself. She did not wait for them to stop. She drew needle. The first man barely had time to turn before. She cut his hamstring, dropping him screaming into the dirt. She ducked beneath a wild swing from another, spun and sliced open his throat. Chaos erupted. Brienne of Tarth, sworn to protect her queen, cut through the battlefield like a storm, knocking men aside with brutal efficiency. The queen's guard, handpicked by Arya herself, followed in her wake. But Arya was not waiting for them to protect her. She was in the thick of it, moving like a shadow, faster than any of them. The Brackens and Blackwoods finally realized who they were fighting. By the time the battle ended, 20 men lay dead. The rest knelt in the bloodied mud, their heads bowed, waiting for Arya's judgment. Lord Amos Bracken, his face twisted with pain from a wound in his leg, dared to look her in the eye. "Your Grace, this is a family matter." Arya slammed her, boot into his chest, knocking him onto his back. She crouched over him, pressing the tip of needle against his throat. "You killed your own people for a feud so old you don't even remember why it started." Her voice was calm, steady, dangerous. "Do you know what I do to men like you?" Bracken swallowed hard. Arya didn't wait for an answer. She stood, turning her gaze to Lord Benjicott Blackwood, who was already on his knees. His eyes were wide, with something between fear and admiration. He had heard the stories. They all had. "You swore to serve the realm," Arya said, her voice carrying over the battlefield. "And you have failed it." She turned to Brienne. "Take their men's swords." "All of them." Brienne hesitated. "Your Grace, leaving them unarmed." "If they want their weapons back," Arya cut in, "they'll have to earn them." And so it was decreed. Every man who had fought in the battle would be put to work repairing the damage they had done. They would build homes for the villagers, tend to the fields, and distribute food. Only when their debt was paid would they be allowed to bear steel again. As for Bracken and Blackwood, Arya gave them a choice. "Swear loyalty to the realm, not your petty feud," she told them, "or I will have both your heads." Benjicott Blackwood knelt immediately, pressing his forehead into the mud. "I swear it, Your Grace." Bracken hesitated. He was older, prouder, but when he looked into Arya's eyes, he saw no mercy there, only certainty. He swallowed his pride, and he knelt. By the time Arya returned to King's Landing, word had already spread. The Queen had personally ended the conflict in the Riverlands. She had shed blood herself. She had not hidden behind castle walls or listened to honeyed words in council chambers. The people began to whisper a new name. New. "No," Arya admitted, "but I care about the people." Davos studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Then let's give them a queen worth believing in." Arya Stark had never wanted to rule, but if she was going to do it, she would do it her way. No crowns, no games, no mercy for those who preyed on the weak, and the lords of Westeros were about to learn that the hard way. It did not take long for the lords to test Arya's rule. Less than a fortnight after she had given her decree, reports reached her that House Bracken and House Blackwood had reignited their centuries-old feud in the Riverlands. Blood spilled onto fertile land, grain stores burned, and villagers were caught between two warring banners. Arya didn't call for a council meeting. She didn't waste time sending ravens or demanding explanations. She rode. By the time she and her small retinue arrived, the fields outside Raventree Hall were thick with smoke, the bodies of farmers rotting under the sun. The Bracken and Blackwood men were still clashing, swords ringing through the air, their banners whipping in the wind. Arya did not announce herself. She did not wait for them to stop. She drew needle. The first man barely had time to turn before. She cut his hamstring, dropping him screaming into the dirt. She ducked beneath a wild swing from another, spun and sliced open his throat. Chaos erupted. Brienne of Tarth, sworn to protect her queen, cut through the battlefield like a storm, knocking men aside with brutal efficiency. The Queen's Guard, hand-picked by Arya herself, followed in her wake, but Arya was not waiting for them to protect her. She was in the thick of it, moving like a shadow, faster than any of them. The Brackens and Blackwoods finally realized who they were fighting. By the time the battle ended, 20 men lay dead. The rest knelt in the bloodied mud, their heads bowed, waiting for Arya's judgment. Lord Amos Bracken, his face twisted with pain from a wound in his leg, dared to look her in the eye. "Your Grace, this is a family matter." Arya slammed her, boot into his chest, knocking him onto his back. She crouched over him, pressing the tip of needle against his throat. "You killed your own people for a feud so old you don't even remember why it started." Her voice was calm, steady, dangerous. "Do you know what I do to men like you?" Bracken swallowed hard. Arya didn't wait for an answer. She stood, turning her gaze to Lord Benjicott Blackwood, who was already on his knees. His eyes were wide, with something between fear and admiration. He had heard the stories. They all had. "You swore to serve the realm," Arya said, her voice carrying over the battlefield, "and you have failed it." She turned to Brienne. "Take their men's swords." "All of them." Brienne hesitated. "Your Grace, leaving them unarmed." "If they want their weapons back," Arya cut in, "they'll have to earn them." And so it was decreed. Every man who had fought in the battle would be put to work repairing the damage they had done. They would build homes for the villagers, tend to the fields, and distribute food. Only when their debt was paid would they be allowed to bear steel again. As for Bracken and Blackwood, Arya gave them a choice. "Swear loyalty to the realm, not your petty feud," she told them, "or I will have both your heads." Benjicott Blackwood knelt immediately, pressing his forehead into the mud. "I swear it, Your Grace." Bracken hesitated. He was older, prouder. But when he looked into Arya's eyes, he saw no mercy there, only certainty. He swallowed his pride. And he knelt. By the time Arya returned to King's Landing, word had already spread. The Queen had personally ended the conflict in the Riverlands. She had shed blood herself. She had not hidden behind castle walls or listened to honeyed words in council chambers. The people began to whisper a new name. "Can scare me? That I'll run? That I'll be like the kings before me, cowering behind walls while you plot?" She drew her dagger, the same dagger that had slit the boy's throat. She turned it over in her hands, running her thumb along the sharp edge. "I have played this game longer than you," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "I learned it from men more dangerous than any of you." She walked toward Lord Velaryon. He stiffened. She smiled. Slowly, she moved to Lord Grafton of the Vale. He swallowed hard. Finally, she stopped before Lord Lannister. He had always been the loudest in his protests, the one who questioned her rule most openly. She held out the dagger. "Go on," she said. "Try again." Lord Lannister's face turned red. "Your Grace, take it," Arya said, her voice steel. "If you think you can kill me, do it now. No shadows, no hired knives. Here I am." Silence. The lords shifted, uneasy. No one moved. Arya smirked. "That's what I thought." She turned, walking back to the throne's empty pedestal. "You don't have to like me," she said. "You don't even have to respect me. But you will fear me. She sheathed her dagger. "This is my only warning," she continued. "If another assassin comes for me, I won't waste my time hunting the one who sent him." She let the words settle, watching the realization dawn in their eyes. "I will burn your house to the ground," she said. "I will erase your name from history." Silence. Then slowly, one by one, the lords knelt, not out of love, not out of loyalty, out of fear. That night, Arya stood at the window of her tower, looking out over the city. She heard the door creak open behind her. She did not turn. "I let them live," she said. "That was mercy." Davos Seaworth sighed. "Aye, but mercy only lasts so long." Arya smirked. "Then let's hope they don't test me again." Davos was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You should sleep, Your Grace." Arya Stark had never felt more awake. The morning after the failed assassination, Arya rode out alone. The lords of Westeros were watching her too closely, whispering behind her back, testing the limits of her patience. She could not rule from behind walls, could not breathe in the suffocating halls of the Red Keep. So she left. No guards, no banners, just a horse, and the wind at her back. She rode west, through the ruined farmlands and scorched villages, where the scars of war still lingered. Small folk watched her from behind broken fences, their faces hollow with hunger, their hands calloused from rebuilding what had been lost. They did not bow. They did not cheer. They simply watched, and Arya understood. She was their queen, but they did not trust queens. Queens had burned them, crushed them beneath dragons and steel, promised peace only to bring more war. So Arya did not speak. She did not announce herself. She dismounted, walked into the nearest village, and sat beside an old woman grinding grain with shaking hands. She took the woman's work into her own hands and helped. She did not explain. She did not need to. The people stared. A child, barefoot, her face smudged with dirt, watched her with wide eyes, as if seeing something impossible. A queen working. Arya stayed for 2 days. She ate the same food they ate, drank from the same well. She hunted in the nearby woods and brought back fresh meat, leaving it at the village center without a word. Only when she was ready did she climb back onto her horse. As she turned to leave, the old woman who had let Arya grind grain beside her spoke. "You're not like the others." Arya pulled the hood of her cloak over her head. "No." The old woman studied her, as if measuring her soul. "Then don't become them," she said. Arya rode back to King's Landing in silence. When she returned to the Red Keep, Davos was waiting. "Where did you go?" he asked. "To remember," Arya said. Davos narrowed his eyes. "And what did you remember?" Arya glanced around at the grand halls, the nobles who walked through them with their soft hands and softer hearts. "I remembered why I hate this place," she said. The next council meeting was not like the last. The lords and ladies were quieter. No one dared challenge her, but the tension hung in the air, thick as fog. Arya sat at the head of the long wooden table, her fingers tapping idly against the surface. "Tell me," she said, "how much gold is left in the treasury?" Lord Grafton, the new master of coin, cleared his throat. "Enough, Your Grace." Arya's eyes flicked to him. "Enough for who?" Silence. "Enough for the lords?" she continued. "For the merchants, or enough for the people?" Grafton hesitated. Arya leaned forward. "The Reach has food, but the Riverlands are starving. The Westerlands hoard their wealth while the Crownlands rebuild on broken backs. Why?" The lords exchanged glances. "Because," Arya answered for them, "this kingdom was built for you, not for them." She stood. "That changes now." She pulled a parchment from her belt and unrolled it onto the table. It was not a decree, not a tax order, not another meaningless law. It was a list of names. "These are the wealthiest men in Westeros," she said. "Not lords, not warriors, bankers, merchants, traders who grew fat while the war tore this realm apart." Lord Velaryon frowned. What are you suggesting, Your Grace? Arya looked him dead in the eye. I am suggesting, she said, that they pay for the kingdom. They profit from. Davos chuckled under his breath. Your Grace, Lord Grafton said carefully, taxing the merchant class so heavily could create unrest. They could withhold trade, collapse our economy. Then they can starve with the rest of us, Arya cut in. Silence. You misunderstand something, she continued. This is not a request. She pushed the parchment forward. By the end of the month, I expect the Crown's treasury to be overflowing. If it isn't, I will personally visit every name on that list, and I will collect the debt myself. No one dared argue. Arya Stark was not like the kings before her. She was a wolf, and the wolves had come to feast. That night she stood in the ruins of the throne room, looking at the empty pedestal where the Iron Throne had once sat. It was gone, and she did not miss it. Davos found her there. You scare them, he said. Arya smirked. Good. Davos stepped closer. You scare me too. She looked at him, curious. Why? Davos sighed. Because I've seen rulers like you before, people who wanted to change things, to break the wheel. They never lasted long. Arya was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I don't plan to last long. Davos frowned. What does that mean? Arya turned back to the empty space where the throne had once been. It means, she said, that I don't intend to rule forever. The night wind howled through the broken windows, and somewhere in the city below, the people whispered the name of their queen. Not out of fear, not out of hatred, but out of something new. Hope, Arya Stark, had no patience for luxury. The nobles of King's Landing were used to feasts, to grand halls filled with silk-draped courtiers, to sweet wines and honeyed words. But Arya did not throw feasts. She did not fill the Red Keep with laughter or music. She was a queen who walked the streets, who saw the wounds of the kingdom with her own eyes, and what she saw enraged her. The noble families still lived in excess, dining on roasted meats and fine wines, while the small folk survived on stale bread and rotten fruit. The merchants who had been ordered to contribute to the treasury had done so, but they had doubled their prices, squeezing the people dry to make up for their losses. It was greed. It was rot, and Arya was tired of rot. She did not call the council together this time. She did not send warnings or edicts. Instead, she acted. At dawn, her riders spread through the city, knocking down the doors of the wealthiest merchants. The money they had stolen was taken back. Every last coin, every hidden chest of gold, every gem tucked away in secret vaults. The merchants protested. Some tried to fight. They learned quickly that Arya Stark did not make empty threats. By noon, the gold sat in the streets, counted before the eyes of the people, and when the sun reached its peak, Arya herself stood before the gathered crowd in the city square, speaking without banners, without guards, without ceremony. This is yours, she said simply. The people did not cheer right away. They were not fools. They had seen kings and queens promise change before, only to take everything back. But when Arya ordered the bakers to begin handing out food for free, when she ensured that the gold was used to rebuild homes, repair wells, and clothe the orphans of war, the people understood. She was not like the others, and for the first time since the war ended, King's Landing felt something it had not felt in years. Relief. The nobles reacted exactly as Arya expected. By nightfall, the great houses were in uproar. The Lannisters, the Valyrians, even some of the Starks' oldest allies. They were furious. The merchants were powerful. The nobles relied on their wealth, their trade, their influence. Your Grace, Lord Grafton said, his voice strained. This redistribution of wealth has created unrest. The nobility feels... Arya tilted her head. The nobility feels? Grafton hesitated. Did they feel anything when the small folk starved? She asked. Silence. Arya leaned forward, her eyes cold. Let them be angry. Let them curse my name in their halls. Let them call me a thief. I do not care. She stood, her hands pressing against the table. But if they act against me, she said, her voice like steel, they will learn what happens to thieves who take from their own people. The lords understood the warning, because Arya Stark was not a queen who forgave. She was a queen who collected debts. 3 nights later, the city burned. Not all of it, only the mansions of those who thought themselves above the law. No one knew who had set the fires. Some whispered that it was the people themselves, that the merchants and nobles had hoarded too much, bled the city too dry, and the small folk had finally snapped. Others whispered something else, that it was the Wolf Queen's justice, that Arya Stark had no use for the wheel of power that had crushed so many, that she was burning it. Davos found her standing on the walls of the Red Keep, watching the fires in the distance. "You knew this would happen," he said. Arya didn't look away. "Yes, you let it happen. I didn't have to let it happen," Arya said. "It was always going to happen," Davos sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "They'll fight back." Arya smirked. "Then let them." She turned to him, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "They want me to play their game," she said. "But I never played by their rules." Davos looked at her for a long moment. "You're not like the others." Arya exhaled, her breath curling in the night air. "No," she said, "I'm not." By dawn, the fires had died. The great houses had lost their wealth, and Arya Stark had proven once and for all that she did not rule by gold, or by fear, or by power. She ruled by justice. And Westeros would never be the same again. Arya had drawn a line in the dirt. The lords and merchants now understood what she was. They could not buy her. They could not threaten her. She had no use for their titles, their gold, or their politics, and so they did what desperate, wounded animals always do. They gathered in the dark and plotted her downfall. The first rebellion began in the Westerlands. The Lannisters, what was left of them, had never accepted Arya's rule. They had bent the knee, but only because they had no choice. Now, with their wealth threatened and their influence stripped away, they made their move. Lord Martin Lannister declared Arya's reign unlawful. He claimed she was a tyrant, a wolf who had no place ruling over lions. From his stronghold in Lannisport, he gathered men, sellswords, disgruntled lords, those who longed for the return of the old ways. It was a familiar story. A noble house, clinging to power, a rebellion, rising in the name of tradition. Arya had seen it before, but she was not her father. She would not hesitate. When word of the rebellion reached King's Landing, Arya did not summon her council. She did not write letters or send envoys. She sharpened her blade. Then she rode. She did not bring an army, only 100 of her best fighters, hand-picked, fast-moving. She had spent years traveling the world, learning from assassins and killers, watching how the strong were brought low by those who moved in silence. Lannisport had walls. Strong, thick walls, designed to keep armies out, but Arya did not march an army to its gates. She crept inside. It took 3 nights. On the first night, Lord Martin's most trusted captain was found dead in his chambers, his throat slit in silence. On the second night, the weapons storehouses burned. The men who tried to put out the fires were cut down in the alleys, their screams swallowed by the wind. On the third night, Arya Stark walked into Lord Martin's hall and laid his steward's head at his feet. The lord had barely drawn his sword before Arya's dagger was at his throat. "You should have stayed quiet," she told him. "The rebellion ended before it had begun." By the time Arya returned to King's Landing, the nobles were terrified. She had ended a rebellion before it could rise. Without war, without armies, she had made a lesson of the Lannisters, and now no lord in Westeros would dare move against her. But fear was not enough. Arya knew fear could turn. She needed something more. She needed a future. That night, she met with Sansa. Her sister had come from Winterfell at her request, but she had been wary. The North was independent now. It was strong, thriving under Sansa's rule. And though Arya was her blood, there was something different in her eyes. Now, something distant. "You rule like a Stark," Sansa said, "but you fight like something else." Arya smirked. "Good," Sansa shook her head. "Not good. You can't rule like this forever. You've made too many enemies." Arya leaned back in her chair. "Then I won't rule forever." Sansa studied her, cautious. "What do you mean?" Arya's expression didn't change. "Westeros doesn't need another dynasty. It doesn't need another family ruling over it for centuries, rotting from the inside. It needs something else." Sansa's brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" Arya looked out the window over the city that had once been her enemy. "When I leave," she said, "there won't be another king or queen." Sansa's breath caught. "Arya, I'm breaking the wheel," Arya said. "For good. The end was coming, not her death. Not war, but the end of kings and queens, and Arya Stark would make sure it happened on her terms. The Red Keep had been rebuilt, but Arya Stark had never called it home. She had ruled for 5 years. 5 long years of war, rebellion and bloodshed. 5 years of breaking the power of noble houses, of crushing those who still clung to the old ways. 5 years of giving the people a kingdom that had never truly belonged to them before. Now, her work was almost done, and Arya Stark was ready to leave. The council chamber was silent as she spoke. "There will be no more kings," Arya said. The lords and ladies stared at her, their faces frozen with shock. Even Davos, her most trusted advisor, looked uneasy. "You can't just—" Lord Valerian started, but Arya cut him off. "I can," she said simply. She stood, pacing slowly around the room. "For centuries, this kingdom has been a game played by the powerful. It has been ruled by bloodlines, by crowns, by war. And where has that led us?" Silence. Arya let the question hang in the air before answering it herself. "It has led us to ashes, to chaos, to death." She met their eyes, one by one. Every king and queen who has ever sat on that throne believed they would be the one to change it. They never did. They never could. She turned to Sansa, who was watching her carefully. "You rule the North because your people chose you." Sansa nodded. "And that is how it should be," Arya said. "Not just in the North, everywhere." She turned back to the council. "When I step down, the lords of each region will govern themselves. There will be no Iron Throne, no single ruler holding the realm hostage. The people will choose their leaders, and if those leaders fail, they will be replaced." Gasps, murmurs. "This is madness," one lord whispered. Arya smirked. "No, madness is expecting a throne built on blood to ever bring peace." Davos exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're serious about this?" "Completely," Arya said. Valerian shook his head. "The people don't know how to rule themselves." Arya tilted her head. "Then it's time they learned." The announcement sent shockwaves through Westeros. Some called it foolish, others called it brilliant. But no one could deny that Arya Stark had done what no ruler before her had ever dared. She had ended the game. The nobles tried to resist, but the people, those who had once suffered under kings and queens, stood behind her. They had seen what happened when power was hoarded. They had seen the suffering it caused, and they would not let it happen again. The last remnants of the old order crumbled. Westeros did not become a perfect land, free of war or corruption, but it was no longer bound by the weight of a throne. It belonged to those who lived in it, not those who claimed it by birthright, and Arya Stark was free. On the morning of her departure, she stood on the docks, looking out over the sea. The ship that would take her west waited, its sails billowing. In the wind, Sansa stood beside her. "You're really going," Sansa said. Arya nodded. "There's nothing left for me here." Sansa studied her, sadness in her eyes. "You could stay. Rule in the north with me." Arya smiled softly. "You were always meant to be queen. I never was." Sansa took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Will I ever see you again?" Arya hesitated. "Maybe." And then, without another word, she turned and walked up the gangplank. The ship set sail.